Good evening and a very, very warm welcome to the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow. As well as everyone joining us here in person, we have a large global audience joining us online. We apologize we're late, the perils of a live event. We have over 200 people registered to join us over the 3 days, and we're thrilled to have such a fantastic turnout here tonight. We know there are many, many things going on over the course of COP26. My name is Gail Hurley. I'm a senior advisor to the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, and it's a real privilege to be opening this Adam Smith at the COP series of lectures. A little bit about us. You saw already our video. GEFI, the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, is a non-profit organization based in Edinburgh, but with very much a global reach, dedicated to ethical finance and to unlocking more finance for the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and for climate action. GEFI's work is inspired by the Scottish Enlightenment that seeks to inform a new and better finance paradigm, one which puts positive outcomes for both broader society and the planet at its heart. And as it says behind me here, finance for positive change. That's what GEFI is all about. It's therefore very fitting that with COP26 in Glasgow over these 2 weeks, we should look at the Climate Change Summit through the lens of Scotland's most famous academic son, Adam Smith. This evening's session forms part of GEFI's broader Path to COP26 campaign and is the first of 3 lectures taking place here at Glasgow University this week, where we'll be exploring the macroeconomic themes behind the COP26 negotiations, starting tonight by looking at the accumulation and employment of capital, stewardship in the climate era. So tonight we will zoom in on what responsibilities the owners and managers of capital have in the climate era and how can they meet these in practice. Tomorrow we will cover the political economy of climate change, asking that gazillion-dollar question that we all are desperate to solve. And at the heart of COP, who pays for climate action? And of course, this has been very, very much in focus this last week, so that's another conversation I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well. We conclude on Wednesday this week with an interactive lecture looking at the life and times of Adam Smith, using actors and a live stage performance to bring Adam Smith to life. That promises to be something a bit different, so please join us for that as well if you can. So this lecture series is based on a short book which we are launching today, and which was edited by Sam Weldon-Bayes of GEFI, who's really been the driving force behind this work. So congratulations to you, Sam, for putting such an excellent lineup of essay writers and thinkers behind this. It comes highly recommended as an excellent stocking filler this Christmas, so please don't walk away without one. The book is entitled The Wealth of Nations in the 21st Century, and is a collection of unique essays from, as I said, 5 exceptional thinkers and authors from around the world, from the fields of finance, economics, development, and politics, all contributing essays inspired by each of the 5 books of the original, and reflecting on how Smith's thinking can guide our approaches to climate action, and even what Smith himself might have thought about the climate crisis. Would he have been at this weekend's climate change march, for example? And what would he have made from the many avalanche of commitments to net zero that we've seen everyone make over the course of the last couple of weeks? What would he think of that? Certainly Smith himself was very clear about the great part of the work which is done by nature in the agricultural economy, which he wrote about in his work. And he was also very clear as well that the market must be guided by a moral compass. So the book has already been covered by Bloomberg today, which is fantastic. And you can also view the book online at globalethicalfinance.org/WON21. So please do check it out. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers tonight, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing what they all have to say. But before we turn to them, I have a few announcements and words of thanks to make. So for those of you in the room, please note there are currently no fire drills planned. So if you see a fire, please do shout, "Fire!" And if you hear a fire drill, and if the fire alarm sounds, please make your way out of the building through to the nearest exit. Refreshments are available over here throughout the session, so please feel free to fill your cup as you see fit. For those of you joining the session online through the FX platform, we apologize, you will have to make your tea yourselves. And because we're in the digital age, please do share your thoughts with other delegates and the wider world on Twitter, using the Twitter handle @Finance4Change, and that's 4 as in the number 4, and also using the hashtag Path to COP26. I'm also compelled, before we turn over to the topic proper, to speak about this magnificent chair on my left, which I know many of you have been admiring and has been the topic of conversation. So this magnificent chair is covered in the SDG tartan, which was developed by the Jeffy team. It's a very comfortable chair, I can attest to that. So not only does it look magnificent, it's very comfortable. So if you want to place an order, then please approach one of the members of the Jeffy team. It won't be cheap, I know that, but they might be able to cut you a good deal. Last but not least, a big thank you to the University of Glasgow, and in particular the Adam Smith Business School, for hosting us this evening. And thank you also to Royal London, our partner on this work stream. Okay, so on to the best part. The focus of this evening's discussion is on Book 2, The Nature, Accumulation and Employment of Stock, and we'll be exploring the responsibilities that owners and managers of capital have in the climate era and how they can meet these in practice. Following our keynote speaker, David Pitt-Watson, will be hearing from Sebastian Burnside and Jeremy Lawson, who are chief economists of NatWest Group and Aberdeen, respectively. Welcome to you. And they will be in conversation with the University of Glasgow's Professor Kathleen Riach, who drew the lucky straw and gets to sit in this chair, while the two chief economists will have to make do with the other two chairs. After them, the discussion will be followed by Barry O'Dwyer, who's CEO of Royal London. So we are in a climate emergency. There's no time to waste. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome David Pitt-Watson to the floor to deliver our keynote address. He is one of our contributors to this excellent collection of essays. He's one of the pioneers of responsible investing, and we are delighted to welcome you, David, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Please join me in welcoming David to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. Thanks to Jeffy for putting this on. Thanks also to people for coming along on a wet Glasgow November evening. I'm particularly pleased at the audience here. I was brought up outside Glasgow, and so I'm very pleased that my sister and my brother-in-law, who are both Glasgow graduates, are here, and one of my very, very oldest friends as well from school. So that's great. But yeah, look, my subject is Adam Smith and what he would have said to the finance industry. And look, he lived a wee while ago, so I want to sort of lay out a little bit what Adam Smith said, what I think he said, who he was. What, therefore, he would have said about climate and the climate issues that we're facing today. And then I'd like to go on and say what I think he would have said to the finance industry Now, last week we had lots of announcements from the finance industry. For example, $130 trillion worth of banks and fund managers and insurers saying that they were determined to be net zero by 2050. What would you have said to that? What would you have said to the announcement that we are now going to have an international sustainability standards board telling companies what they need to report on sustainability? And then I'll finish with just a couple of minutes of my own thoughts about where I think we are on all of this. So, Adam Smith. He writes The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and he is a major figure in this extraordinary period of Scottish history, the Scottish Enlightenment. I mean, the number of really radical thinkers and doers that were based in Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen in particular, is extraordinary. 1776, of course, was the American Revolution. 1776, if you come to Glasgow University, by that time Adam Smith was retired and he'd gone to Kirkcaldy, to where he lived, to write The Wealth of Nations. You would have found that James Watt was here, perfecting the steam engine. Of course, the steam engine provided the power for the Industrial Revolution. It also provided the carbon dioxide, which we're now having to deal with. By the way, talking of carbon dioxide, the mentor of James Watt was a guy called Joseph Black. He was the first person to identify carbon dioxide and its characteristics. Again, he was at Glasgow University. Adam Smith knew him well. He was executor of Adam Smith's will, along, by the way, with James Hutton, whom some of you may remember was the person, really the father of geology, and the first person to explain that this world went back millions upon millions of years and was not created with the Garden of Eden in 4004 BC. This was an amazing period of thought. Now, Adam Smith, he was the professor of moral philosophy here. And indeed, his first book, and the book I think he kept rewriting, if I remember, was one called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And his view of humankind was that the humankind was a moral being and needed to be thought of as a moral being. By the way, for any of you who are listening to this, you will know that when you study economics, that thought disappears in an assumption that we are all homo economicus, people who are simply trying to benefit ourselves. He was also famously absent-minded, by the way. He was a professor and an absent-minded professor. Apparently, he's supposed to have fallen into a tanning pit one time when he was walking around thinking about what he was going to put into The Wealth of Nations. But he was the father of economics. The first person to really think about, here's how he put it, how to provide a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to allow them to provide such a revenue for themselves. And in this, he didn't come up with big theories. Again, if you're studying economics, you'll know that you study this through a theoretical lens. Adam Smith is about practical things. And his practical observation is that it's labor that creates wealth and value. And that you can have very productive labor or you can have very unproductive labor. And labor becomes more productive the more it's specialized. The example he gave was of a pin factory, where if one person makes the pointy bit and one person puts the point on it, one person puts the top on it, you produce many, many more pins. And therefore, if you want specialization, you want the market to be as big as it can possibly be, with lots and lots of trade. So that when I look at my iPhone, I know that there was someone in Taiwan who knew exactly the sort of plastic, that little lens that was going to be the thing that took the photo from my camera and put it onto a digital. That specialization he would have absolutely endorsed. And he further would have said, look, people should get on with this themselves with as little interference from the government as they can, because he would have said, typically when government and business gets together, it's not always clear that that works to the people's advantage. And he made simple, practical observations and advice. That, by the way, is my 60-second introduction to Adam Smith in book 1 of The Wealth of Nations, which is where most people stop. I'm going to talk about book 2 of The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about capital. He calls it stock. And capital includes money, but it also includes everything else. So it includes the equipment that people use, factories, roads, all of those sorts of things that help create productivity. And of course, capital, he wanted money because he needed money to trade, and he liked trade because that was the way people could specialize, and therefore we could become wealthy. But he's also absolutely passionate about the need for all sorts of other capital as well. I mean, and he would say you should always look to build the capital of the nation. I mean, to such an extent that, again, for those of you studying economics, he thinks it would be far better to manufacture things where at the end of the process there is something there, tangible, than it is to spend your money on a service, for example, going out to a restaurant where all you've got is a hangover the next morning. And he'd quite distinguish between those. He'd be very keen that people save a lot, because then the savings will be put into capital. In fact, you can almost imagine him advising the Chinese Politburo on their economic policy. Very heavy savings, lots and lots of capital investment. But what about natural capital? Well, you see, the thing is, Adam Smith, he knew that natural capital was there. We can maybe put Rory, the quote up from Adam Smith. He says, in agriculture, let's remember agriculture was about 50% of bit more of the economy in Adam Smith's day. Nature labors alongside man, and though her labor costs no expense, its produce has value as well as that of the most expensive workman. But for Adam Smith, nature was just there. You could rely on nature. It was always going to provide you with rain in November and provide you with a bit of sun in May and give you the harvest when the time came around. Last year, I went to an event in the Guildhall in London, great big ancient building. There was 800 people there, all from the City of London, sort of big cheese financiers. And there was a talk from David Attenborough with some wonderful films as well, you know, the Blue Planet-y sort of films. This is what David Attenborough said about, he's 90, David Attenborough. This is what he said. During the space of a single human lifetime, my lifetime, we have changed the planet so much that the benign, stable conditions which underpinned both the growth of our civilization and the trade and financial systems that you people in the City of London preside over has ended. Adam Smith's assumption that nature would always be there is no longer the case. And I think Adam Smith, as a practical person, would be saying today, look, natural capital is disappearing, and we need to build capital. We need to get to net zero, or you will destroy the very thing that is creating your prosperity. That's what the scientists are saying, and that is exactly what David Attenborough would be saying. So where would he go after that? Well, I think if he was to read the recent report by the IMF, which says that the governments of the world provide a subsidy of $300 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry, he would say that is absolutely terrible. Not only are you destroying capital, you're subsidizing destroying capital. Oh, and by the way, 300 billion more in tax breaks for the fossil fuel industry as well. And he would want to see an end to that. I think he'd also, because he was always full of good anecdotes and comparisons, he would have said, you're struggling with COP26 because you can't find 100 billion, 100 billion to give to the developing world so that they go on a different development path. But you can find 600 billion of subsidies to give to the fossil fuel industry. I don't understand. But if Adam Smith was to read on that IMF report, that 600 billion becomes $5 trillion if you include the damage that the fossil fuel industry is doing through the process. So the damage to health and the damage to climate. Now, Adam Smith didn't have a response to all of that, but subsequently, economists have had such an answer. Most famously, Pigou, who was a Cambridge economist, and he said, look, you have markets, and Adam Smith would have us trade and just do it that way, but sometimes when you trade, there are externalities. By externalities, they can be good or can be bad. So look, if a firm trains somebody, that's good for them because the worker becomes more productive, but actually it's good for the worker as well, because when they go and get the next job, they'll get a better job because they're trained. And what you should do is, if it's a good externality, you should subsidize it. And if it's a bad externality, you should tax it. Now, carbon dioxide is a bad externality, and I think Adam Smith would have said, look, we should tax this. And I think most economists, I've got some real economists in the front row rather than me, would agree that that is what we should do. Indeed, some of the most eminent of them have created the Pigou Club, including many Nobel Prize winners, which says, look, why don't we just do that? It's elegant, it doesn't cost anything because you raise the tax, but you can give it back to people. Particularly, you can give it back to the people that are affected by the higher costs, but then you advantage clean energy relative to dirty energy. And I remember I led the UNEP Finance Initiative in the run-up to the Paris conference. There were some institutions that were so keen on this, they said, you shouldn't talk about anything else. Don't talk about anything else. We need to tax carbon. If we don't tax carbon, this will become really complicated. You'll discover there's people that have to make one decision on gas-fired power stations, another one on coal mines, another one on this, another one on that. If we could just get that tax in, that would be the way that we would solve it. And indeed, today, there is negotiations going on about Clause 6 of the COP, which is precisely about how it is that we set the rules for the taxation of carbon. But we haven't nailed that anywhere close in the last 20 years. And I suspect it's going to be some time until we do. So there's Adam Smith. He's thought of his good economic answers. But what about the finance industry? You see, just some things about Adam Smith. Adam Smith would not have been afraid to intervene in the finance industry. One of the things, if you read Adam Smith, that he thinks is a good idea is capping interest rates. Here's his logic, maybe if you follow it from what I've said in the last 10 minutes. What he says is, if you're lending money at a very high rate of interest, the reason you're doing that is because you don't think you're going to get your money back. And that means that the capital is going to be destroyed. Furthermore, we've only got so much capital, and you ought to be giving it at a low rate of interest to somebody who will build the capital stock of the nation and make us all wealthier, and instead you're giving it to somebody at a very high rate of interest. So he was in favor, even of the government capping interest rates. He'd further have said, look, if you're thinking about the world, we're all moral agents. You don't need to wait for governments to do things. You're a banker. You're a moral agent. Just watch It's a Wonderful Life, where the local banker is the hero. And I think he'd also said this. He'd have said, that money in the finance system, it doesn't belong to the fund manager. It doesn't belong to the insurance company. It's our money. and that therefore you're under a duty to think about whose money it is when you invest it or you lend it on to somebody else. I think that's where he would have come from, and therefore it's from those perspectives that he would have interpreted what it was that we saw last Wednesday. By the way, it sounds terrific. $130 trillion pledged to be net zero by 2050, 40% of the assets in the entire financial system. And the announcement of this International Sustainability Standards Board. And look, there is some money that is flowing, and I think it's absolutely wonderful that that was done. But I think Adam Smith might have had some observations on this as well. Because, you know, Adam Smith thought lending money to people was a really difficult thing to do. And by the way, investing in the shares of companies was even more difficult. Here's what he said. He said, if you're going to lend money, you need constantly and carefully to inquire into the conduct and situation of the company that you're lending the money to, or the person that you're lending the money to. Now, we need vast sums of money coming from the north to the south so that they go on a different development path. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, even some of our biggest banks like NatWest simply don't know how it is that they could take your money and invest it in a country like the Congo, for example, or Ghana. And we should be honest about the fact that we need a very, very big program to think about how it is that we do that. By the way, Adam Smith would have been even more skeptical about investing in the shares of a company, because the shares of a company are permanent capital, so you give your money away with no promise of what it is that you're going to get back. And Adam Smith would have said, you want to watch out for that sort of deal, because negligence and profusion, those are his words, negligence and profusion will prevail in companies that have been given money and don't have to make any promise about what they're doing. So look, I think there's a big gap in that promise. We're ready and willing, but we're not able to fund what it is that we need to do. And that should be a very big challenge for all of us, as it should be for policymakers. But look, there is some stuff that we can do. I mean, in particular, we can think about whether or not we should be encouraging the existing fossil fuel companies to make more investments or not. I would have thought, for example, that Adam Smith, with the same logic as his logic on interest rates, would have said, look, I don't want banks or fund managers lending money to companies that are then going to open a coal mine or have another oil well, because we know we don't need any more of those. I mean, we know because the International Energy Agency, which, by the way, its job is to promote investment in energy, and it's told us that we don't need any more of these. So shouldn't we be doing this now? No new money to things which are going to be producing fossil fuels that we know we can't use. No new money, and remember, it's not your money, it's somebody else's money, and it's your duty to make sure that that money ends up creating a world in which those people can live and live well. So 130 trillion saying that they're going to be net zero in 2050, it's great, but I do have some sympathy with the protesters who say, but show me what it is that's happening today. It's a bit like the drinker who tells you that they're going to give up alcohol in 2050. It's not something that you necessarily believe. But protesters often say as well, and I think Adam Smith might pull them up on this, that you should sell the shares of companies, the permanent capital in fossil fuel companies. I think he might push back against that. Do you remember he said negligence and profusion is what you're going to find where companies have got permanent capital? Well, we've overcome that problem And we overcome that problem using the same means that we did in politics, which is we gave the shareholders the vote. Every director in Britain, every director, every year seeks re-election. So tell me, why, if I'm a fund manager managing other people's money, why would I be approving the re-election of a director who would not put their company on a net zero path by 2050? That's including BP and Shell and all the other big oil companies. It would seem to me that just using your vote that way is something that would be sensible and simple, just as withdrawing new money would be sensible and simple. And look, I'd have a couple of other ideas, but let me just do one more, which has particularly been part of what I've been doing for the last couple of years, which is it's great that we're going to have an International Sustainability Standards Board. I think that sounds like a nice idea, and companies will declare what it is that they're doing. But we already have an audit and accounting industry. By the way, Glasgow has a particular point in the audit and accounting industry because the companies were forced to have an auditor, an independent audit, after the collapse of the City Bank of Glasgow in 1870-something, which was a Ponzi scheme. But the way in which accounts are drawn up today turn a blind eye to climate. If you want to be cheeky about it, you could say they're encouraging an environmental Ponzi scheme, where an oil company can invest in an oil well and then, if it discovers oil, can value it as though that oil is coming out of the ground in 2060. Well, that oil can't come out of the ground at 2060 because we won't have a stable climate. So that's something for the accountants to do as well. So I think if Adam Smith had looked at the finance industry, he would have said, look, the stuff that you can do and the stuff that you can do now, no new money. It destroys capital. It destroys natural capital. No directors who will not promise you that in good faith they will try hard not to destroy natural capital in the companies they manage. And no misallocation, which suggests that natural capital is infinite and that profits can be made through its destruction. You know, that's not too hard, is it? I think, indeed, it's relatively easy. So why have we not achieved this in the finance industry? I think it's because there's been a problem about the clarity of purpose. What is it that we are trying to do as we move money from where it is to where it is that it's needed? A lack of leadership in the 4 or 5 things that are really important that we've got to do, not just declarations, but 4 or 5 things that we've really got to do. And also, by the way, determination and pressure from the people whose money it is to say, you've got to change. Because if you don't, you destroy capital, and the David Attenborough quote is something that you should be thinking about all the time. By the way, I don't think at all it's got to do with the fact that somehow people in the finance industry are bad. They're not. They're just like other people. They're moral people, as Adam Smith would have seen them. But they need leadership, they need clarity, and they need determination. And so I think if Smith were here today, I think he might have been quite optimistic. I think he would have said, you know, in 250 years, humankind has been amazing. I would never have believed that you could have built the financial, the physical, the intellectual, the social capital that you've done since I wrote The Wealth of Nations. That everyone, almost everyone who's born lives to old age. That everyone is entitled to an education. That you have income and opportunity that was unimaginable in my day, where 80% of the Scottish population of 1 million lived in absolute poverty. And I think he would say, you will be able to address this climate change. You will be able to do that. I hope I've not misrepresented him. I think he would be looking for simple, practical things we could do, and I hope maybe that some of the things I've suggested might be on that agenda. But look, I leave the last word to David Attenborough. It's the Guildhall. There are 800 people dressed like me. Actually, some of them are a lot smarter than me. In the Guildhall, they give the man a standing ovation. And he's just told them the value we place on a stable, natural world will ultimately determine its future. Do we invest in the practices which take us deeper into this crisis, or in the solutions that will get us out of it? Now, finance can't do everything. Technology, governments, regulations have got a huge role to play. But we know we can do something. And with clarity of purpose, with leadership, with determination and pressure, I think, and I deeply hope, that we can get there. And I think Adam Smith would have done as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, and I think it's always fantastic to end on a note of optimism about what can be achieved should we put our minds to it. And thank you. That was really an excellent overview of some really topical issues currently in the financing world, seen through the lens of Adam Smith. So I encourage all of you who haven't yet done so to please do go ahead and read David's excellent essay. So as you said, David, Adam Smith recognized very clearly the value of natural capital in his writing, and that if he were alive today, he may very well say that, you know, if you destroy natural capital, you destroy productivity and the foundations of your prosperity. And I was also very struck, I think, by what you were talking about on climate finance. And you asked whether we could find the 100 billion that had been promised in 2009 for climate finance, and the need to reorient much more flows of finance from north to south. You mentioned some eye-watering sums spent on fossil fuel subsidies, but I think we should also recall what has been spent globally on the response to the coronavirus pandemic. Over 5 trillion globally on responding to the pandemic. So I say that to say that, you know, the money is there. The money can be found, and we know that the next 10 years are very critical in delivering the economic transformations the world needs to see if we are to limit global heating to below 1.5 degrees. So we really need to nail that financing question. That's what David spoke about as well. So perhaps we should look to our next panel to actually solve that question. So no pressure there at all, but you are, after all, the bankers and the investors. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Kathleen Riach of the University of Glasgow, who will be joined in a fireside chat with Sebastian Burnside from NatWest Group and also Jeremy Lawson from Aberdeen, where they both have the role of chief economist. So please join me in welcoming them to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, as we're going to kick off immediately, and as Adam Smith talks about in Book 2, which is considered one of his most complicated and complex books out of his entire oeuvre, he talks about the need for critical reflection and thinking to bind together disjointed objects to bring about order. And I think the finance sector really needs to engage in that critical thinking to think about how we're going to address climate change. So to start off, I really wanted to turn first to you, Sebastian, and I wanted to hear a bit more about NatWest and how you've been working through those kind of current strategies surrounding working through climate challenges with yourself and your stakeholders.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, so we have climate as part of our purpose. We think that this is clearly a societal challenge and a defining one for many of us, and that we are uniquely placed to help the UK and the millions of customers on that transition to net zero by halving the emissions of our customers' activity between now and 2030. And a lot of the work that's gone into understanding what that means and how we can help has focused on bringing back some of those aspects that David talked about understanding the impact of business as usual on the stocks of natural capital, in particular on the stock of the climate, and the consequences of mitigated actions to that. Where I think we're looking for solutions really starts with our customers being able to, in an intensely practical way, footprint what they're doing, what their impact is, where those reliances are. And once you have that grounding and a reasonably strong expectation of where either government policy or prices or investors' preferences or even just your own as a moral sentiment, moral being, a view of what should be done, then we can lay in chain the kind of tools in order to make real action happen on the ground. So that's the intensely sort of practical approach that we've taken to helping our customers move towards that status.
Great. And Jeremy, I wonder if you could talk a bit more generally about how we might be working on those strategies to mitigate towards climate-related risks.
Yeah, so something that we do within Aberdeen is we spend a lot of time on building what you might call plausible scenarios of the future, right? So different climate pathways, how policies across countries and sectors, they vary in different circumstances, and then what does that mean for asset prices? And then when you have a deep understanding of what those future pathways might look like, well, then you're in a much stronger position to sort of to analyse, well, how are you going to allocate or reallocate capital along a chosen pathway, or how are you going to build solutions that meet different asset owners' requirements? So I'll give an example because I think it relates to one of David's points, right? So David's exactly right that asset managers we're stewards of capital, right? There's not a cent or a pence, p, whatever, so I'm Australian, so I'm going to say cent. Not a cent of that money, right, do we own ourselves, right? It's all money that we manage on behalf of other people. However, different asset owners have radically different expectations of how we will act as stewards of that money, right? It's definitely not the case that asset owners are all beating down our door saying, please demonstrate how we can get onto a 1.5 degree pathway. There's a subset of asset owners for that is true, and then we work with them, partner with them, this is how you can do it. But then others will come to us and they'll say, I want to maximize my return over such and such a time frame, and actually I'm operating in a country, a jurisdiction that is not just not on a 1.5 degree pathway, it's not even on a 2 degree pathway, so I need you to take that into account. So one of the big complexities when you're a global asset manager is how do you take all that diversity, right? So that, again, those people whose money it is and what they want from us, and how do we put this all into the mix so that we can sort of both contribute to the energy transition, but also meet the demands that we have from our clients.
Yeah, and I guess when you were talking there, I was thinking about, Adam Smith talks about, well, underlying the whole of the wealth of nations is the idea of mutual interdependencies, isn't it? Where, you know, we rely on each other for this kind of mutual flow of capital. And I guess this speaks to the idea of just transition, where you mentioned, you know, there's some individuals for which this is a really front and centre point, there's others that view economic viability in perhaps more traditional terms. So thinking about this, you know, in light of this idea of a just transition and a recognition that we are all mutually interdependent and also disproportionately disadvantaged through the effects of climate change, how do we create a balance between that recognition whilst maintaining what might be seen by some as an economically viable approach? What would you say, sir?
So I think a big advantage of being able to get these factors into mainstream kind of macroeconomics more effectively is to be able to sort of push aside some of the kind of naive counterfactuals that you might use for policy making, where you were able to carry on producing GDP at the same rate you were. Meanwhile, you know, man is sort of separate from nature, and we have continuing degradation with no sort of, you know, no plausible impact on the system. And I think that is the, I'm not going to attempt to try and solve the political economy point, but I think that will be helpful for the reframing of the costs of climate action if we are benchmarking it again, not against a naive counterfactual, instead against something which is much more plausible. That's an incredibly complex task, and it's you know, lots of those answers are going to be unknowable and incorporate extraordinarily large ranges of outcomes when you're doing that detailed scenario work because of the complexities and the interdependencies. But I think it has a hugely important role in playing in helping reframe that debate. And therefore, if we have a better starting point of the evidence for policy making, when we're talking about the relative impacts on different people and institutions and stakeholders, then surely we're in a better starting place about to rearrange how to make that work for everyone according to whatever political lens you then want to apply on it. So I think fixing those informational fundamentals is a really important part of that.
Yeah. Would you agree, Jeremy?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree that information is important, but I don't think it's going to get you very close to solving the problem, unfortunately, right? So it's been well known for 20 years that the cost of the energy transition to the economy, even in narrow terms, is not actually especially high at all. And that's even when you apply traditional discount rates to future economic activity, right? Once you reinterpret that lens, it's very clear over the very long term that this would be additive. That's not actually the problem, right? The problem is a political economy problem, and it's multidimensional, right? So let me use an analogy, right? Why is the consensus around globalization breaking down, right? Part of the reason why the consensus around globalization is breaking down is because the beneficiaries of globalization are diffuse, right? And the communities, the individuals that can be harmed by those structural adjustments, they're concentrated and have not been adequately compensated for the costs of those policies. Well, there's a very close analogy when it comes to climate policy. So again, I'm Australian. Right? So why has Australia struggled so much to develop a coherent climate policy? Well, it's because many of the jobs that are tied up in the fossil fuel industry in Australia are located in very sensitive political communities, right? And so there's a short-term political incentive to effectively address policy at that group. Now, a more sensible policy might be to say, actually, we really recognise that you're going to be at the fulcrum of this adjustment, so how can we make sure that, say, revenue from a carbon tax is recycled so that that can sort of aid sort of structural change in your communities so that you're not disadvantaged, but that hasn't happened. And then you take that extra step, that's even just within a country, right? But how many politicians are incentivized to properly take into account the consequences of their actions for people that don't vote for them, right? So we're talking about the global north and the global south. Take the UK's aid budget. The UK has been cutting its aid budget, right? Which wasn't even that high to begin with. And how many people are marching the streets, right? To sort of how many people's votes are going to change in the next general election because of that. It's too small, right? And so that is a chronic problem because that 100 billion that was cited before, right? That's a drop in the ocean in terms of what is necessary. That number was always insufficient to aid the energy transition in the global south and cope with the adaptation that is necessary just for the climate change that we can't avoid from here. But until mainstream political attitudes change about what is the legitimate concern of a voting population, then we're going to be sort of stuck talking about this problem for decades. So that's not a very positive sort of, I realise, but there is an enormous credibility gap and it's not closing at the moment.
I mean, I think, you know, to kind of return to what Seb was saying about those kind of attitudes, because one of the key aspects that you mentioned right at the beginning was NatWest's role, you know, not just as an organisation with significant capital, but also is working with key stakeholders. Do you see a kind of slightly more optimistic or proactive role that financial institutions might take?
I think there is one in the sense of there is a broadening of decision makers' breadth of account of which they're taking into account different stakeholders already, right the way across the economy, and I think probably especially in finance. And it's, you know, time will tell, but I think that applies to groups of asset owners as well. I think to the broader constituency to which people in those positions are trying to do the best job for, then you have the best possible ingredients to make progress. I don't dismiss the concerns that Jeremy sets out for a moment. I'm just not confident that we're going to have a big bang moment where we ever overcome that. And therefore, I feel like we have to, you know, it's a bit like going back to the carbon pricing, right? Ask an economist how to do an allocation problem and they'll come back to you with some sort of pricing answer. If that's not the first, if that first best outcome isn't available, then we have to use all sorts of other tricks in the armoury in order to achieve good progress. And right now, with the scale of the emergency and the amount of work that has to be done between now and 2030 in a relatively short period of time, I think it's the framing of the race to zero and getting everyone to ratchet up that layer of ambition. It applies to countries. It can probably be applied to all sorts of different stakeholders in this process as well, rather than waiting for that big bang agreement which fixes everything in one go.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, of course.
Right. Be very clear to the audience, there is no race to net zero happening at the moment, right? It's a race that there's a very small number, right, of stakeholders in, and a very large number who are effectively in a race to something completely different in terms of their actual concrete behaviour, right? So I'm going to lay it out very starkly, right? So in the 3 months between when sort of COVID sort of shut the global economy down in 2020, you know, to when the reopening sort of began, and global emissions declined by 6%, right, in that window, right? That 6% was smaller than the annual rate of emissions reduction that is necessary every year for the next 30 years, right, to be consistent with the net zero 2050 pathway, right? So this gap it's not a small gap, right? And then those emissions have now rebounded by 5% already. They're continuing to rise. By 2023, they'll be above 2019 levels, right? So this is the part of what concerns me. It's very easy, in fact, it can sound great to be here, talk optimistically. But if you look at the concrete actions of whether it be the corporations, the governments, people in our industry, everybody that contributes is part of this problem, the scale of the action is completely inadequate. And yes, it's true that trying to wait for a efficient carbon pricing global emissions trading scheme, that's unlikely to occur. But if the externality is not internalised, if it's not incentivised, financial flows will not align with that pathway, right? The self-interest, or maybe the way to put it in David's parlance, the ethical obligation that individual institutions have in our industry or in the corporate environment, not enough of them will change behaviour unless forced and incentivised to do so. And so that is why we're on a pathway which is more likely, which will very likely blow through 2 degrees.
And this could be a rabbit warren, in which case stop me. But I think one of the interesting roles that finance can play here is in transmitting the information to help shift aspects of that, because the point at which our customers get most excited about the opportunities to reduce their carbon footprints is the point at which they understand how rapidly, total range of speeds, how rapidly their customers are becoming, it is becoming a function, an item in the function of their customers' decisions about who to work with. And that's very different for different sectors, different segments of individual markets. But a lot of the problem that customers face day to day on living their lives and interacting with the economy is just not knowing whether item A or product B is better or worse for them, better or worse for their preferences for the environment, and therefore they're not in a position to respond to any signals. And I think because of the role that finance plays touching all parts of the economy, we can help through informational tools to help get that measurement going right the way to the customer. So in the same way that food labelling works, in the same way that you check what your current account balance is on your app, we are testing tools to help you be able to have that same information about your environmental impact. Not a finished job, but I think that progress towards that path could be really constructive to help make this much more of a customer conversation for so many businesses.
So I wanted to pick up on kind of mix that behavioural change piece with ideas that you mentioned, Jeremy, about the instruments that are being put in place. So the emissions trading system, carbon tax, and so on and so forth. I mean, are these radicalising the system, or is there a piece of work that has to be done before they're going to have a positive impact?
So you're asking before those policies would have an impact. I think if those policies were introduced, they would have a radical impact on emissions pathways as long as the pricing that underpinned them was consistent with that pathway. I think maybe the more interesting question again in the world that, there's that concept in economics which is the world of the second best, right? So the world of the first best might be carbon pricing, emissions trading schemes. We're in the world of the second best. So what are some of the other things, the other types of policies? Well, emission standards are an example of that, right? So if you think about, so you can impose emission standards on the automotive sector, and if you make them stringent enough, they can sort of force very significant sort of change in the nature of the vehicles that are designed. And actually what they do is, again, there's this concept in economics called a shadow carbon price, right? So you can have formal carbon pricing, but the shadow carbon price is the de facto carbon price, but it's effectively disguised within the command and control policy that you're putting in place. So there's lots of options to go down that pathway, right, where you can sort of regulate instead of formally price. They're often less efficient, but because they disguise the cost, sometimes they're more politically feasible than other types of options. There are probably some opportunities to take more advantage of behavioural finance and things like those sort of concepts of nudging people in the direction of making better decisions. But again, it's the responsibility for the dilemma we're in isn't going to be really solved by individuals, at least not collectively on the scale that is necessary. The reason why carbon prices are usually levied on large emitters is because that's the most efficient place to levy it. And you don't want to, the responsibility, again, you're talking about just transitions, the responsibility for managing those consequences, I think, has to be levied on those that are responsible for generating the problem in the first place.
I think there's a lot that can be done on expectations. So take the really obvious kind of EV transition in auto. As far as my understanding of it goes, there's no one country which the global auto manufacturing industry decided, which told the global auto manufacturing industry that they had to invest for zero emission vehicles. The global auto industry has read the runes, understood the trajectory of where policies are ultimately going to go, and to quite a large degree are probably going to be running at the pace of pretty much the most ambitious so far rules that are written down and coded. So I think you can do a lot through simply creating enough certainty is the wrong word, through creating enough pokes in the right direction, even without it being priced or codified. Now, maybe that's a special case because we're talking about actually a really handful of kind of firms globally. And that's going to be difficult to repeat that trick for something that's totally distributed like agriculture, but vitally important. But I think it's a good example of how the people running those firms, I presumably think they're acting in the best interests of their shareholders in a financial sense, but probably also with a nod to a few other stakeholders as well.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's right. They've been nudged in that direction. The transportation sector is becoming less carbon intensive. We shouldn't be under any illusion that the transportation sector, though, is on a net zero 2050 pathway, right? So this is part of the balance here. I sound very negative in this conversation. That's my personality. Apologies for it. I have a very strong BS filter, and in the COP meetings, there's been a lot of it, unfortunately, and it's upsetting. But it's, there is an energy transition taking place. It's a very significant one, right? For example, last year, if you look at the increase in the share of wind and solar sort of usage in the power sector, it was very significant. And it has been for 10 years. The relative price of solar PV has been dropping over the last 10 years at a much faster rate than anybody forecast. There are big changes occurring. It's just we have to be super careful about confusing that with the ultimate goal, right, which, as I say, is that 1.5 degrees or failing that below 2 degrees, because it's that gap. You can both have an energy transition and still fall short of what is necessary. So it's that wedge that I'm interested in how we can close.
I wanted to now shift gears slightly and talk a bit about natural capital, because David introduced the concept, and I guess what we read about in book 2 of Adam Smith is quite a particular view of nature that is encased in the history he's in, and I guess that's very different to our post-romantic 19th century view of nature. So Adam Smith thinks about nature as being innate, being there, being plentiful, and being assumed. And of course, as David mentioned, we simply aren't in that state or in that luxury. But to what extent, when we think about natural capital as a different flavour of capital, are we really set up to make seismic changes or even start to measure what natural capital means or is within the economy?
So I think it's hugely challenging, and there are a growing number of approaches, but they taking different views of how to ascribe largely still monetary value to it. So either its role in enabling a production process like fertilization or of pollinators, for example, or through sort of equally anthropocentric but like recreational value of capital existing. I see it more as I'm skeptical about our ability to ever really properly integrate that into the rest of the kind of the model, if you like, of how everything turns out to produce human welfare. I think instead maybe it might be more constructive to think about what well-being we are trying to promote for the people of the countries that we're serving, and approach the problem that way, because that would allow you to take into account, yes, the kind of material goods and services side, fine, that's tricky but largely done. Yes, nature, but also a whole host of other social and environmental factors which brilliant that nature is getting as much profile as it is, but we also want to live in communities that are thriving and provide all sorts of other opportunities for people as well. So that feels like the lens that I would go for.
I'm going to sound a bit more optimistic for a change. Oh, isn't that crazy? I presume there are a bunch of economists in this audience. I don't know whether that's true or not, but people have sort of got a business lens. But hopefully people realise that we have systems of national accounts and ways of trying to measure the capital stock that's in existence in different economies and globally. Increasingly, those measures of the capital stock have become more sophisticated over time. So for example, they used to be primarily built on physical capital, right? Things that, you sort of, David, you spoke about it, right? Sort of Adam Smith sort of favoured the things that we can sort of tangibly produce, but actually in the modern world is actually largely the growth coming through intangible growth. And we've become much better at that, of integrating that into measuring in GDP and national accounts. Actually, in growth accounting frameworks, we also have to measure human capital, right? I mean, again, sort of labour, but human capital is sort of critical. And I don't think conceptually there's any reason why a system of national accounts, right, or capital accounts, financial flows, can't at least begin what would be a very complex, I don't want to sort of give the impression that you can sort of do this in a short period of time, but start beginning a project of properly evaluating or valuing that natural capital stock. Because I absolutely agree with that sort of that statement in the lecture, that it is essential. But if you don't try to value it, if you can't put a price on it, often it'll end up being undervalued, right? And so if we can measure that, then you have a way of then sort of integrating this system, right, integrating the analysis, and I think you then sort of stand a better chance of being able to develop sort of tools that confront, well, okay, so this is how we value that, and that activity can be understood as running down that natural capital in that particular way, then you can sort of do welfare analysis. And that is within the gifts of governance, right? There's no reason why you couldn't sort of task statistical agencies, right, or a sort of a broader group of experts, and you would need a very broad group of estimates to start down that sort of process. So yeah, I would like to see that.
Okay. I'm very aware of time, but I wanted to turn to something that we've touched upon as we went along in terms of the role of government and dare I say regulation. And I guess Adam Smith's view, as we hear about in book 2, is not the kind of the pop fiction account of Adam Smith as having completely unregulated markets. In fact, he actually talks about the need for an infrastructure that works alongside and with the economy and keeps up with economic growth and various trends. Do you think that we're currently keeping up with economic trends in terms of working towards climate change, or does there have to be those kind of more top-down interventions in order to work on that path towards 2050?
I think we need an enormous amount of top-down interventions. We need everything. Most answers to climate is not A or B. It's the whole alphabet. And so yeah, I think there's great scope for interventions across the whole swathe of the economy. I think it would be nice to get the price signals slightly less out of line than they are now. I think that would do a world of good. It strikes me that there is scope to do that, whilst looking after those who would be most acutely hit from a welfare perspective of any of those changes. So yeah, I think that would be hugely welcome.
Yeah, climate change is arguably the largest market failure in history, right? That's the way I would think about it. And market failure, I mean, for decades there's been an articulation within economics of how you address market failures, and it is through sensible regulation that say internalizes, forces the internalization of the externality. That's not only through carbon pricing. There are a whole bunch of other things that can be done that are complementary to it, but as I say, the economy on its own, in the presence of those market failures, will not solve for the problem. And so it needs intervention. There's no doubt about it. And then on top of that, right, and this is why it's such complex, it's also an example of the tragedy of the commons sort of writ large, which is, right, let's say that the United Kingdom, right, and Scotland, right, got its whole act together, and actually the UK, if you were to order countries from worst to, best to worst, it's in the top, one of the higher echelon countries, not towards the bottom. But let's say that it got itself exactly onto a credible 2050 pathway, although I would argue that the UK should be 2040, because if emerging markets aren't going to do it by 2050, you need a balance. But anyway, actually I've lost my train of thought. What was the point I made before the emissions?
About pathways in terms of regulation and.
Yeah, I've completely lost my turn. Isn't that strange?
Let's kind of return to Adam Smith and be a bit playful, because I guess he talked about. He was critical of some forms of taxing, so he mentions, the idea of beer and alehouses, and he mentions that, tax upon beer is an artificial security against drunkenness, which I think is an excellent quote against any kind of taxation system. But I guess to close with, I was thinking, how might we ensure that, whether that's regulation or whether our attempts as a system, a financial system, don't become, an artificial security against really achieving climate change? What are some of those kind of the danger points that we need to make sure that we avoid?
I think it would be the awareness of the interdependency, and that's hopefully been helpfully illustrated by the experience through the pandemic, about just how reliant on all sorts of different actors, near and far, known and unknown, we all are for going about our daily lives and our thriving. And if we can have greater awareness of that, then that would helpfully fuel more responsible decision making by everyone with the power to do it.
I remembered my point.
Oh.
It was about the international dimension of it, right?
Okay.
It doesn't matter if the UK aligns, right? If right, the planet doesn't care where the emissions come from. In fact, people in this audience probably know UK consumption emissions are much higher than its production emissions. The system of accounting is primarily built on measuring production emissions, right? But effectively the UK deindustrialised and shipped off a lot of its emissions into poorer countries, right? And so, that collective action problem has to be solved as well. But to your point, I think something we haven't talked about here tonight at all really much is adaptation, right? Sometimes because the language of net zero 2050, whether it be the finance sector, government, it infuses everything, which is, that's the ultimate objective. But we can't lose sight of the fact that even that, let's say we sort of limited climate change to 1.5 degrees, well, that's still an extra 0.4 degrees beyond where we are now, right? It's plausible that there are tipping points associated even with that increase. But if we were into a 2.1, 2.2 degree world, actually most of the capital that's going to need to be deployed over the next 30 years, 40 years, 50 years isn't the energy transition, it's actually adaptation to the radical changes in the climate that are almost sort of certain to occur and will affect many of the poorest people in the world, right? Particularly sort of in like Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa, sort of the Asia Pacific and the islands in particular. And, we're talking about sort of finance gaps, right? And there is a big finance gap sort of through that Net Zero Alliance still. But there's an even larger one when it comes to how we're going to sort of adapt to it. Because again, very easy for me to sit in the audience talking about adaptation because I can pay my way to adaptation, but more than 1 billion people will not be able to do so. And so I think that is in a sense, the moral challenge that is sometimes forgotten here and needs to be absorbed.
Fantastic. Jeremy, Sebastian, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, Jeremy, Sebastian, for a fascinating conversation, which I think could have gone on for hours. Some quite sobering views, I think, on government policy, the finance industry, where we currently are, and where they need to go in order to have any real and tangible impact on net zero, despite the buzz and the plethora of commitments. But also some bright spots, I think, I hope. We have to be optimistic. You spoke about the pace of the energy transition being much faster than had previously been anticipated, and a growing recognition of the need to value our natural capital stock and the need to channel far more finance into nature-based solutions. And I think that, at least I have seen over this COP26, far more energy and momentum around nature-based solutions than was ever on the agenda before. So I hope that we continue to see that moving forward. I'm delighted to now welcome our final speaker to the floor this evening, Mr. Barry Dwyer, who's CEO of Royal London, who is our partner to the Global Ethical Finance Initiative for this event. So a very warm welcome to you, Barry, and please join me in welcoming Barry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail, and good evening, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here, and I'd like to start with thanking our hosts and organisers at GEFI for their hard work, not just in putting together this event in Glasgow at COP26, but also in the 6 months that led up to bring the essay series to life. It's our pleasure at Royal London to have been involved in this work and to enable it to happen. And I want to pay tribute to our own Casey Rayner, who's a force of nature at Royal London and has been a driving force behind this project. Royal London is a major provider of pensions, and I suppose I'll start there. With the rise of private pension provision, particularly through modern workplace pension schemes, our society has moved away from a model where governments and employers provide pensions to a model where governments and employers have stepped back, and the emphasis is on the individual instead, creating what we call a new investor generation. But many of these new investors feel ill-prepared to take on this responsibility. Our research tells us that customers are more interested than ever in the impact that their savings can have, but that they rely on us as the providers of their pension to make good decisions on their behalf. The UK has the 4th largest long-term savings market in the world and looks after about £2 trillion worth of assets. The role of investors as the stewards of our customers' capital has never been more important. Now, within the long-term savings market in the UK, Royal London operates as a mutual insurer, owned by its customers and run for their benefit. This is actually relatively unusual today, as almost every other large UK mutual has demutualised and become shareholder-owned. Some of this was driven by a carpetbagging trend in the 1990s, but for whatever reason, whilst most other major economies have protected their mutual sector, and upwards of 40% of insurance in Germany, US, and Japan is provided by mutuals, we've allowed the market share of mutuals in the UK to dwindle to below 10%. Royal London is now the largest mutual in our sector by some margin, and the only positive I take from the reduction in the number of mutuals is that it gives Royal London a unique competitive advantage in this market. It's with that context in mind, over the next few minutes, I'll explore why we believe being a mutual makes it easier for us to do the right thing for our customers, what stewardship in the climate era means to Royal London, and why we must rethink our decision-making frameworks to incorporate the value we rely on from the natural world, some of the concepts that we talked about earlier. Okay, unsurprisingly, my view is that mutuals are a natural way for people to organise their long-term savings because they allow people to pool risks together and to share the cost of investing. When managed well, mutuals are inherently more efficient than stock companies because there are no shareholders demanding dividends. If Adam Smith were here with us today, I think he would agree. And despite the image that he may have as the father of the free market and the champion of corporations, the truth is, and David mentioned this, he was less than complimentary in his critique of what is now the typical corporate structure. He believed that directors of such companies would not look after the interests of stakeholders with what he called the same anxious vigilance with which people would watch over their own money. It's also reasonable, I think, to assume that he would have been aghast at the way many people invest their hard-earned life savings passively into tracker funds, which just buy every company in the index, regardless of what its management is up to. What Smith referred to in this warning is what we've come to understand as the agency problem, which we as a mutual believe we face to a lesser degree because we've no shareholders. Instead, we're run for and on behalf of our members. However, this agency problem is ever present in the companies in which we invest. So let me turn now to the need for robust stewardship by asset owners as we face the climate challenge. This is an area where the UK has taken a leading position in articulating the role for asset owners and asset managers through the FRC's Stewardship Code. This was revised in 2020 to reflect the belief that stewardship with a focus on the long term and a desire to deliver social as well as financial benefits is key to securing the best outcomes for our customers and for society at large. I would also commend the series of essays to you. David did earlier, but they really are excellent. And in the review of Book 5, Dr. Zeti Aziz extends this concept beyond the current financial services definition of stewardship and proposes that the decades of negligence and plundering of the natural world confer an additional responsibility and accountability on the owners of capital to ensure the sustainability of our planet. She proposes a vision of a 21st century Adam Smith as a strong voice and advocate for the protection of the environment. This Adam Smith would call for urgent action from both the state and the market to deliver an outcome that would allow our progress and prosperity to be enjoyed by future generations. Now, David mentioned a quote from David Attenborough at the Guildhall, but for many of us watching the opening of COP26, David Attenborough's words also rang true when he talked about the potential for the globe's smartest species to be doomed by failing to see the bigger picture in pursuit of short-term goals. This is the essence of stewardship in the climate era. We must, as stewards, challenge the companies we invest in to overcome their inherent focus on the short term, to think and act long-term in a way that allows us to meet our current needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. This is why we must rethink our decision-making frameworks to incorporate the value we derive and rely on from the natural world. The distinguished authors of the essay series have argued that nature determines the worth or the value of our future, and this is increasingly compromised. That the reductionist concept of a rational, self-economic man, which has underpinned the theory of markets for the last 40 years, is insufficient as a tool to navigate the future. This is where the role of effective government and institutional interventions are key, which is what the panelists were just saying. And that's highlighted by Sir Muscatelli in his revisit of Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations. And in the Paris Agreement, it strikes me we have the North Star to guide our action. The agreement made in 2015 goes further than an ambition to limit temperature increase and states an explicit objective to reorient finance to achieve sustainable outcomes and to do so in a just, fair, and equitable way. The Sustainable Development Goals have codified this into a set of objectives which align development with the objective of achieving outcomes which are not at the expense of future generations. And with the recent rulings on the inclusion of a sustainable future as an inalienable human right, we can see that we're beginning to move in the right direction, even if the pace, as we've noted, is sometimes a little bit problematic. But there is hope, I think, emerging from Glasgow. With the progress made by the Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero and the announcements from the UK Treasury on the need to rewire the financial system. In these announcements, we see the recognition that we just talked about, that market forces alone can't tackle the problems that we're facing, and an acceptance that regulatory interventions are required to drive financial flows into a Paris-aligned pathway and power an energy transition to realize our net zero ambitions. Now, as somebody noted, we have seen an energy transition in the UK before. The deindustrialization of the UK and the closure of coal mines, for example, have left scars across our country that many communities continue to experience. At COP26, we've seen some great ambition to end the era of coal, but the way we do this is important. We must transition in a way that protects the most vulnerable, whilst making changes that we need to protect the environment. To do this will mean we may need to move carefully and to spend more on developing new skills. This is important if we're to mobilize all sectors of society, retain the consensus that we have over climate change, avoid alienation that Jeremy spoke about, and ensure that the widening inequalities that we've seen emerge over the last 20 years are not exacerbated. And of course, it's not just coal that we'll be phasing out. Many other sectors will need to go through major upheaval, affecting jobs and creating a need for reskilling on a scale we've never seen before. Alongside this, we'll be asking people to change the way they live their lives, how they heat their homes, the cars they drive, and even their eating habits. Change on this scale requires a major overhaul of how companies interact with their customers and communities. This is why a focus on enabling a just, fair and equitable transition is at the heart of the Paris Agreement and is one of our priorities at Royal London. We believe that simply divesting from climate-destructive assets is insufficient. Simply changing the ownership of the company will not change the company's activities, and ultimately, it won't have the impact of reducing real-world emissions. That's why we're working with the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and our peers to create a Financing a Just Transition Alliance. The Alliance recently announced a new report outlining the elements that should be considered in the development of a just transition plan for companies. At Royal London, we're putting this into action through our engagement with companies in the utility sector. In the last 18 months, our work, in collaboration with other members of the Alliance, has secured just transition plans from 5 leading utilities companies: SSE, E.ON, Centrica, EDF, and Scottish Power. We'll continue our engagement with the utility sector, and in 2022, we'll extend this to cover some of the largest emitters in the UK. Through engaging with the companies we invest in, living up to our responsibilities as stewards, and using the rights we have to direct the companies we own through our voting, we believe active ownership and effective stewardship will enable real change with real-world impact. At this point, I'd like to focus, actually, as Casey did in her work on the essays, on the theory of moral sentiments, which David mentioned earlier, which was Adam Smith's first book. For Smith, the theory of moral sentiments was his magnum opus, and the Wealth of Nations a subsidiary. Quite why the Wealth of Nations has become so favoured and the theory of moral sentiments neglected is not entirely clear. But if the Wealth of Nations is to provide an explanation of wealth, markets, and the role of self-interest, it's the theory of moral sentiments which boldly asserts the role of empathy and articulates a fundamental principle which we appear to have overlooked, that for society to function fairly, the invisible hand must be guided by a moral compass. And it's in the theory of moral sentiments that Smith explores the way in which the excess of hubris and consumption can be tempered by the feelings of mutual obligation. He says, however selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though they derive nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. For the first time in decades, a serious mainstream debate has begun on the social purpose of the corporation, with organizations such as Business Roundtable, World Economic Forum, and even religious leaders challenging the power of multinational corporations and their profit maximization motive, which is, after all, putting at risk the habitability of the planet. And this is where Smith might contradict his more fervent 21st century free market followers. Where company intentions and actions are not aligned with the needs of society, he would argue for intervention, to reassert the human nature of empathy for others into our corporate world. So what would our economic system look like if we were to amend the concept of rational economic man whose self-interest guides the free and invisible hand of the market, to one where we prioritize the well-being of society rather than purely private profits, act in the interests of the multitude, recognizing that acting in good conscience is how we conceptualize the best versions of ourselves, and provide direction to the undoubted efficiency of markets via a clear articulation of the moral purpose of finance and its role in society. I believe this is where there's an opportunity for a renaissance of the mutual model of corporate organizations alongside B corporations and cooperatives as a model which moves beyond individualism and recognizes our inherent interdependence and reliance on each other. The recent pandemic has been obviously dramatic on so many levels, but in some senses it has acted as a catalyst for change. As we enter a new normal, there's a real opportunity to reflect our changing needs and aspirations, with a greater understanding of our interdependence, the need for fairness and equality in society, as well as the fragility of the natural world. Ultimately, as you know, it now falls to our generation. We are mutually responsible for determining the shape of the century to come. And the shape of the century depends a lot on this decade. We can no longer be passive bystanders, but active participants and influencers of change, and we have no time to lose. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Barry. A really excellent speech. I learnt so much. Thank you so much for sharing your views on stewardship from an asset management perspective and so many more things. And thank you in particular for emphasizing the importance of a just, a fair, and equitable transition if we're to bring along all communities and find support for a transition, a new economic model amongst all communities in society, and that actually this empathy is also at the heart of the theory of moral sentiments as well. I share your view that it's an excellent set of essays, so if you haven't already, please do take the time to look at them more closely. Congratulations to the Jeffy team and all of the authors for contributing to the publication and putting it all together. We look forward to reading it and some of you may indeed find it in a stocking filler as well. I won't attempt to summarize today's conversation. It's been very rich. I know it could have gone on for much longer, but let me please thank all of our speakers very much indeed for joining us again tonight. So, yeah, let's say thank you. Thank you again to our hosts, the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow, our partner at Royal London, the whole Jeffy team that I know has worked very hard behind the scenes to make this happen, our tech team over here as well. Thank you to all of you who are joining us either in person or online. I would have loved some time for some Q&A, but perhaps some of our speakers would kindly hang around for a while, so please do feel free to harass them mercilessly if you have some burning questions for them. And if you are interested in that gazillion-dollar question, who pays for climate change, then please do join us again tomorrow, same time, same place, for the second in our lecture series of 3. So many thanks to you all again, and wishing you all a very lovely evening, afternoon, or morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.